Good afternoon and welcome to Enterprise Agile Going Waterfall webinar with Manav Mihan and Steve Grafton. Just a brief note about eSynergy before the presentation. eSynergy specializes in open source and cloud resourcing. If you are looking for a new opportunity or to build out your team, please get in touch after the webinar. Now, moving on to some housekeeping. If you have any questions for Manav and Stephen, please fire them over via the questions box throughout, and Manav and Steve will answer them at the end of his talk. We are recording the session, and the slides and recording will be made available and sent to you tomorrow by email along with my contact details. Now, I'm going to pass over to Manav and Steve to begin the talk.
There we go. Unmuted. That's good. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. Manav, over to you.
Great. I think I can't see the screen. There might be just refreshing.
Okay. How about that?
Yes, that's much better. The lovely image of Waterfall. Very soothing. Okay. Great. So welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining us in this webinar, which is very nicely titled as Is Enterprise Agile the New Waterfall? We've all lived through the waterfall experiences, a sequential way of working and doing things one after the other very nicely, taking a bit longer than expected. And then, of course, we swung the other way. We've kind of done Agile in different shapes and forms, whether it's Scrum, Kanban. Some people just stood up in the morning, had a quick group huddle and called it, yeah, all good stuff. None of these are wrong things, but then are these total Agile is something which we'll explore today. Also, we run a lot of large-scale transformations, so we will share with you some of the patterns which we have seen, some good, some not so great, and you can certainly learn from our experiences. So if we move to the next slide, at least you can see who we are. So moving on to the next one. So the person talking right now is me, Manav. I am the Global Agile Consulting Lead from TCS, and then we have Steve Grafton, who you'll hear in a minute. So I've had lots of experience. Yeah, thank you. So I've had lots of experience in the industry working for various large-scale organizations like Microsoft, Yahoo, Legal & General, Lloyd's, having transformed their ways of working. And I've been lucky enough to take these organizations, quite a few of them, into where they've had some spark of Agile into quite a few of them, which are a very mature Agile organization. So we will be sharing that journey with you. I have been with TCS over 5 years now. And over to Steve to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Steve. Like Manav, I've sort of seen the good and the bad and the ugly, and our job is to help you recognize the ugly and make sure you do the good. I've got a background in software development, and both on the sort of delivery side, if you like, as part of an organization that's transforming, and then as part of TCS helping people transform, doing that for a number of years now. So yeah, looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you today.
Great. So if we go into the next slide then. Yeah, so these are some of the topics which we're going to cover with you today. As we discussed, they are patterns. And I know some people like to call it anti-patterns, but there is no such thing as an anti-pattern. It's just a pattern, which is not a good one. So we'll be sharing with you Agile adoption patterns, both good, bad, and not so good, or in other words, ugly. And then we do want to talk about the ready-made scaled methods. You might have adopted some of them. You might have heard about them. They might be sold to you like the best thing after loaf bread, or as they say, it's the Scrum killer or the next Scrum. It just sort of reminds me sometimes when people iPhones came out and everyone was creating the iPhone killer. So yes, Scrum's been popular and everyone's creating the kind of next avatar of Scrum. And look, we have nothing against them. TCS itself, we are a gold partner for Scaled Agile. I am certified, what is that? Yeah, I'm certified in Safe. Yep, and so is Steve. So what certification do we have? I even forget about that, Steve.
The SEP.
Yeah.
SPC, Safe Program Consultant. There you go.
Yeah, so the latest version 4.0, we are trained on that, and we have worked with lots of other methods. So it's not that we are just standing on the sidelines and just saying, well, these methods, what about them? But actually, we just want you to see for yourself what will work for you and what won't. And in all fairness, let's get it out there. These are not necessarily silver bullets. You can't just say, we're going to take one, put a straitjacket approach, and we will be agile. In fact, that's exactly what we do want to make you aware today, that if you take a plan-driven approach towards agile, then we are back into Waterfall things, because there was nothing fundamentally wrong with Waterfall, but that false sense of security and that illusion of control that, yes, if we only plan well enough, if we only do this as it says on the tin, we're going to be agile. So we'll explore that. And then, of course, getting into a bit more of solution space, talking a bit more about the importance of culture, environment, and the ecosystem as such. And then we'll conclude with a bit of discussion. Okay.
There we go. Right, so over to me, I think. Yes, agile adoption patterns. So we often see the way in which companies adopt agile is starting at the team level. So it's adopted in IT at a small scale at the level of individual projects and or teams. So basically somebody thinks, I'd quite like to have a go at that, and I'm going to try it. And the management team said, well, that's fine, you know, it doesn't affect us, go ahead, have a go. And then it starts to build some software, and there are interfaces to the wider organization via some defined processes, probably so that the reports coming out of the Agile projects look like the Waterfall reports coming out of Waterfall projects. You know, what's your RAG status? Are you going to hit your milestones? How much software are you going to build? And that creates some sort of tension. But, you know, these projects start to show some promise, and so other teams try and do it, but without necessarily the guidance. So, you know, as you will often find, technology guys really like to try stuff out. So you'll find other teams throughout your organization starting to do this, and it begins to build some traction. In the meantime, the rest of the organization is keeping a beady eye on it, and then some of the execs probably start hearing about Agile and go, oh, that's a good idea, yes, keep doing that. I'm quite happy for you to continue to do it. Then we hit a bit of a problem, which is that we want to coordinate these teams now. So there's a program or a program of projects that wants to become agile. So what we try to do is coordinate them. And what we find is that success is patchy, that different teams work in slightly different ways, because that's how we've been building stuff up from the bottom, from the ground. And we find that trying to get these teams to collaborate, to synchronize, and the visibility of what we're trying to build becomes quite difficult. Then we find we've got different agile standards. We've got people measuring their velocity in different ways. We've got slightly different methods. You might even find some teams across the company you've got agile coaches in, and we know if you ask 10 agile coaches how to do something, you'll get 10 answers. So we've got no consistent view for managing our portfolios, and agile portfolio management is seen as too hard, and that is a barrier of getting things properly aligned with the business. In the meantime, we've got some projects, we've got some programs running agile, but most of the organization stays as it is. It doesn't change, it doesn't have to, it sees no reason to. So what happens is some things stay the same. And the sorts of things that we see staying the same: organizational structure, some of the management processes and the tools that the management uses to get reporting, the governance of projects, how projects are funded. You know, the marketing people don't change things. You know, we're still going to promise those 20 features and we're going to deliver them, or you'll see trouble ahead. Our physical environments stay the same. We don't really change things so people can work together properly, which includes the technical environment. So we don't invest in automated tools. We don't invest in the things that help us be agile. And our human resources folk aren't really recruiting for the right sorts of behaviors. Our appraisals and our objectives are all set in the old world. They're not really set towards team goals. Job descriptions, those have to change, and also the way in which we train and we get people through career structures stay the same as it is. So it's very difficult for Agile to break out of those constraints, and it does mean that really what you do is you have an Agile bubble sitting within what is effectively a waterfall, a hierarchical, a command and control organizational structure. So every year the lovely people in version 1 do a state of Agile report, and they survey lots of people around the industry. And this is a slide which is taken from their report, which shows what are the barriers to further Agile adoption. I think it's quite telling that the ones at the top, the ability to change organizational culture, general organizational resistance to change, pre-existing rigid waterfall framework, and even then management concerns about lack of upfront planning, concerns about the ability to scale Agile. All of these things, I think, are a direct result of that type of organic Agile adoption. So we have to somehow find a way to break through those barriers. So Manav, over to you on the ready-made scaled methods. You just need to tell me when to move the slides on, so nod your head and I'll hit it. Over to you, Manav.
Yes, Steve, so just if we go back onto the holding slide for a minute, the one before that, I think it's important to see what Steve's just mentioned, and I think to re-emphasize the point that there's always bright sparks who want to work in an agile way, who want to embed these learnings within the organization. And in our experience, most often, and we were running a workshop yesterday, very similar things, that it's people find it controllable, people find it easy enough to do this in a team setting. Some people have even branched out to do this in a program setting. But really the challenges which Steve was outlining there are quite telling, because if we don't have the rest of the organization at the very least aware and appreciating and pulling this way of working, then it just, in our experience, it just sort of dies a silent death, because it just becomes an exception rather than the norm. And that's where, if you have heard about these scale method, a lot of these are trying to help you sort of implement Agile top-down because they are CXO friendly methods. At least people can see a lot of their organization in these methods. But then are these really the anecdote which people have been looking for to solve all our problems? So we're going to explore that in this particular section. So now if you hit the next slide.
Yes, sir. There we go.
So again, State of Agile survey, as Steve was mentioning, it is probably the most credible and the persistent survey which has been out there. And this is the 10th year running for them. And if you look at this particular picture, it is quite interesting. Now, this is not just scaling methods as yet. This is just what we've all kind of grown up to know of Agile. We have Scrum. 58% of people use Scrum, or 58% of respondents said they use Scrum as a method. And then you have all the other ones, anything from Scrum XP hybrid to custom mixing of methodologies, Scrum ban. Then so interestingly, you have 58%, but you have another 15% on the left-hand side, which are Scrum related in some form or the other. So you got here a dominance which is approximately if I'm doing my numbers right, about 75% or maybe even 80, getting up to 80% dominance of one method. So that is important, because if you look at the other ones, feature-driven development, iterative, unified processes, agile modeling, so that roughly accounts for the other 20%. So that is some telling. Now, if we go into the next slide then, so hold that thought, about 80% of teams use Scrum. Now, here's a view when we start to look at the scaling methods. Now, as I said, you might have heard about it, you might have kind of seen some of these, you might have heard about these because there's a lot of buzz around it. These are sort of the next avatar of Agile, or some people call it like Agile 2.0. You might have even had your senior management team come up to say, well, this is good stuff. If we just do that, one of these, we will be successful. Now, these are not mutually exclusive from what you saw in the previous picture, because as we'll step through some of these sort of thumbnails of each of these scaling methods, you will find that there is Scrum in all of these. And let me put it out there in as clear terms as I can when people ask me about it. There is more that is in common to these methods than there are differences. So let me repeat that. There is more things in common to these methods than there are differences. Of course, if you ask the inventors of each of these, they will say, yes, we are different. And there's a surprise, because of course they have written books, they have certifications, they have all sorts of disciples working for them on each of these methods. So yes, this method is different. But if you step back and really look for it from where we are looking, there is more in common. And the important thing on this particular picture is that, okay, Scrum of Scrums is just an organic growth. That's just Scrum at scale, really. So that's 72%. The next one down, I could even just knock that off, because that's really not right. It's not a method per se. It is just people who have done Scrum and they've grown to do more of it. Then you look at the scaled Agile framework at 27%. So leaps and bounds ahead of some of the other ones which are down below. Because the next one, 23%, is internally crafted methods, and 17% is lean management. Well, that's not really a method. That's just ways of working effectively. So on one hand, you have methods which are barely in single digits. Then you have one which is at 27%, and rest of it is just still a bit of organic growth. So if you were looking at these methods, by all means, but are these the silver bullet solutions? Well, the jury is still out on them. So very quickly, we'll step through some of these for you. So if we click on the next one, so we have Nexus. Sorry, Steve, I'm covering this part, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
sorry,
that's correct.
Apologies. I had to take a business trip out. I'm right now sitting in Florida, and Steve is sitting in London or UK. So we are just coordinating this. So anyone who thought remote working in Agile can't work, well, there you go. Here's a live testimony.
It doesn't. Yeah. Oh, I know. Okay.
Okay. Right. So Nexus. Scrum.org earlier called this a Scale Scrum. Now they call it Nexus. You can go and explore about it. Scrum.org is an organization where some of the members like Ken Schreiber are the people who were on Scrum Alliance before. So they moved on and they created something like that. So clearly Scrum is at the heart of it, and then they are helping out with some other Scrum related terminology. You might have heard about it, you might not have. And if you were trying to correlate this to previous picture, I think that's where it's called Scale Scrum. So that's why Nexus as a term they have coined fairly recently. So we're not going to go into detail of each of these because we want to just give you an essence of it. There's a lot more to it. We just wanted to give you enough of an overview so you can go and make those choices if you choose, if you think this is one for you. So if we go to the next one, please. Disciplined Agile Delivery, or DAD as it's called. This was initially, well, endorsed by IBM, and Scott Ambler was the chief methodologist in IBM. Now, of course, he's branched off and done his own thing. So I'm not too sure IP-wise where does it exactly sit, but it has been endorsed by IBM, and Scott Ambler is the person who championed this particular method. Again, iterations are at the heart of it. There are things which go before, there are things which go after. And if you're used to RUP, you will find there are some interesting terminology around inception, construction, transition, which is very familiar to RUP guys. Moving on to the next one, please. Okay, Dynamic Systems Development Method, DSDM. This is homegrown in UK, and the organizers of Agile Business Conference, they are the same people behind this, the DSDM Consortium. And again, you see there is that iterative development in the middle, which calls evolutionary development here, or you could time box it in scrums and iterations, but then there are things before that, which is pre-project feasibility foundations. You do things afterwards. So this has also gone through multiple iterations. It used to be called DSDM 18, and now it's called DSDM. Moving on to the next one.
Yep.
So this LESS framework, which is large-scale Scrum, is also one of the popular ones, and this was put together by a gentleman called Craig Larman, and there have been some large-scale implementations of that, after which people have then gone off it, but that's still around. It just got quite a bit of focus on product development and feature teams, and it nicely represents this as an ecosystem where there are things, previous sprints, then you have to have current sprints and future sprints. Again, anyone familiar with Scrum will see all of those terminologies very nicely listed in here. But the bit I also like about this is it's sort of got all the peripheral things around it to say you need to have this ecosystem. So just picking on something which is the bottom left, coaching. So it says, you know what, to help you get to this state, you need coaching. There's top left, lean thinking. So the representation is nice because it's a bit like an ecosystem. We'll go on to the next one, please. And this is the one which was 27% and growing, because something which is quite telling about this particular system is this particular framework, Scaled Agile from Dean Liffingwell, is that it is at least at 3 levels. There's an optional 4th level which is collapsed here. And there is no plus sign. It should have been on this picture, but never mind. So you have a team level, then a program level, and a portfolio level. And given that we're qualified trainers for this, we know there's an optional 4th level called value streams in here. And some of the really good things about this framework is that it is built on good practices from the industry. And to a large extent, it's freely available, because you could go into a search engine, which is more than Google. So that, let me tell you that. There is Microsoft Bing, there is Yahoo, at least those 3, and you can put Scaled Agile framework or Scaled Agile, and you will get a link to a website which has this sort of a picture, and each of these boxes are clickable. I can see some people straight away now putting that into a search engine and going to the website. So please pay attention to the rest of the webinar. Okay, so again, this is another freely available framework, and yes, there is certification and things around it. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So what do they have in common? I was doing this, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah. Sorry?
No, just saying I'm supposed to be doing that, so.
Or I can, I don't mind.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Fine.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and this was just an observation, is that people like buying nouns. You know, it's off the shelf, so it's very attractive, as Manav was saying, to CXOs. You know, they give, because they look so prescriptive, there's this this belief that somehow you'll get guaranteed results if you adopt them. And they all give certifications, and we know how much people like to go in and get certified in stuff. We know that certification doesn't necessarily guarantee anything other than money for the people selling the certifications. To some extent, they all have the concept of teams working within programs, and many of them portfolios as well. And actually, as Manav was saying right at the beginning, Scrum is at the heart of a lot of these. But what they don't really talk about, or some of them sort of start to get you there, is business agility and all the people aspects that are involved as well. So it's not just about trying to adopt a process, because what you're trying to do is to get people who are thinking differently. So the stuff they have in common isn't necessarily the things that we need to be worried about, which is minds and hearts. Yes, Manav?
Yeah, sure.
So what actually has changed? So we've looked at that there are all these high sort of highly scalable methods, and some that are not quite so highly scalable. We've putting them into the system, we're putting them into our organization, usually the IT organization. But given what we were saying earlier, what is actually changing? You probably find that you still have got your organizational structure in place. You may find some of your tools and processes have changed, but you find that you still got the overarching governance the same, your funding's the same. Your physical environment, you might have some wheelable charts, you may even have some wall space, but you may not have pods or other sort of visible indicators that you're running an agile environment. And the human resources, are they still looking for all the same keywords? Are your appraisals still very focused on personal achievement? Are the job descriptions aligned to job roles, or are they actually aligned to what your job title is? And do we actually train people and give them a chance to get better at what they do? So what actually has changed, even though you've adopted one of these large-scale methods? And the question that follows on from that then, are we done? We've taken this method in, we've got lots of people using it, are we done? Now, I would claim that no, we're not done. There's a lot that needs to be done, and a lot of it is around the organizational, operational, finance, funding, all those other things that we were talking about, the things that tend to want to stay the same. So we're not done. So avoid declaring victory early. Declaring victory early means that senior managers somewhere will go, oh, great, it's done. We're now agile. We've got these processes in. Therefore, let's disband those coaches. And you remember the Craig Larman slide where that's sort of particularly agile because it's about coaching behavior as much as anything else. It's not giving somebody a book and saying, follow that. So because it's a people-related thing, declaring victory early will mean that your organization will typically slide back into old behaviors, and all that will remain is the terminology.
And if I can just add there, Steve, I think it's a really important point. Time and again we have seen that within an organization, different parts or different functional areas, different sort of cross-functional areas, they all have their own little agendas. So, and there's nothing wrong in that. However, just doing a part of it doesn't mean that you have become agile. We often say there's a difference between doing agile and being agile. So if you keep doing it in different parts of the organization, then yes, you will become agile. But if you need engineering practices to be embedded well, you might need to talk to your infrastructure team. You might need to talk to info security teams. You might need to get those engineering practices embedded in testing. If you need to work on the value stream mapping to realize the value in an organization, you might need to then look at your stories. How do you map onto sort of features or epics, howsoever you want to call it, and then how do those things map onto the value which is to be delivered at the hands of ultimate customer? There's a lot to it, and mostly when people say, well, Agile has failed or Agile doesn't work for us, that doesn't mean that hasn't worked for us. It's the way it's been implemented, and quite often, and more often than not, declaration of that victory early is what leads to a problem, because no executive will want to go back and say, I got it wrong. When I reported it all done, It wasn't done. No one ever says that. So the best thing is to plan in a holistic way and then deliver that holistic change. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. I agree with that. So we're now going to talk a little bit about the culture and environment, which is a little bit to do with when we talk about behaviours. What are the things that we really mean? And I quite like this. So we mentioned Craig Larman earlier, and this was an observation of his. So it's an observation rather than a law. So although we say laws, it's not a law. So organisations are implicitly organised and optimised to avoid changing the status quo, middle and first level managers and specialist positions and power structures. So organisationally, organisations are set up in this hierarchical structure that has a very high inertia. And, we sometimes talk about these things being super tankers, very hard to turn around. So as a corollary to one, any change initiative, and we include agile change initiatives here, will be reduced to redefining or overloading the new terminology to mean basically the same as the status quo. So, for example, you go to a Scrum team and you'll say, show us your stories, and those stories will just be a list of 400 requirements. And it's just, no, those aren't stories, those are requirements, and you've just spent 3 months writing them. So you will find this sort of use of the new terminology that effectively reflects what the old things meant. And as a corollary to one, any change initiative will be derided as purist, theoretical, revolutionary, religion, and needing pragmatic customization for local concerns, which deflects addressing those weaknesses in the organization and maintains that specialist status quo. In other words, you will find that you'll go in and it's like, well, you're agile and you're being purist, that's revolutionary. We need to be really pragmatic because our bit of the business is very special and very different. And the interesting thing about that is, yes, your problems might be different. However, the concepts, the values, the will make those things better are all the same. So yes, let's look at your special circumstance, but let's look at it through the lens of the values and the principles of lean and agile software development. And given all of those 1, 2, and 3, the culture will follow the structure. So if you've got a culture which is command and control, if you've got a structure which is called command and control, your culture will be command and control. And I think it's quite an interesting thing to think about. And that's why, systems of thought like organizational learning aren't very sticky and impactful by themselves, and why systems like Scrum tend to be more quickly impacting culture. Because often when you have a Scrum team, you're bringing people together to collaborate, and that is a change organization. So we need the organizational change to happen at a higher level. Culture eats process for breakfast. There's Heinrich Nyberg. So a systems thinking thought leader guy, a guy called John Seddon, he explains it like this. Attempting to change an organization's culture is a folly. It always fails. People's behavior, the culture, is a product of the system. When you change the system, people's behavior changes. So all of those things that we were talking about staying as is a symptom and a problem, because that is what defines the culture. And if that's what defines the system and that defines the culture and that therefore defines the behaviors, we're going to find it very difficult to get people away from those plan-driven waterfall mindsets, even if we're running stuff in teams that are agile. Just to quickly introduce you, because I'm looking at the time, of the Overton window. It is a political theory. It describes a range of ideas that people accept as acceptable. So you start off where something's really unthinkable, and in the UK we may think in the early part of the last century, women's votes. That was thought of as unthinkable. Gradually over time those ideas were seen as radical, then acceptable, then sensible, then popular, and eventually become policy and written into law. And I think sometimes agile transformation can be a bit like that. So those ideas that we were talking about related governance and finance may well be outside the appetite to discuss, and they are looked upon as radical. It's like, no, we have to know exactly how much that project is going to cost over 3 years. the idea that you can incrementally fund projects is unthinkable, because how do we guarantee the outcome? The fact that you could never do that anyway is somehow, you know, left behind. They don't bring that up. So what we want to do through the whole of our Agile transformation is change the wind. We want to get people to be thinking about these things, even when your teams, if your teams are trying stuff out, you have to be socializing how things need to change across the whole of your organization. And another way to think about it, and I quite like this, introduced by a guy called Richard Durnell from ThoughtWorks, which is the order in which things break. And some people will never get past stage 2. So your people break. Somebody comes in, starts a horrible idea, and people push back. There's a lot of noise. Some people try it, some people don't. But those, you know, eventually people will start changing, and some people will start trying it. Then the tools break. So we don't have the collaboration tools. Everything's about command and control. So the traditional tools then become a barrier to the team working effectively. And change can be hard, because often these products have got a large amount of organizational investment in them. Somebody somewhere has their career built on the fact that they've just spent a number of millions of pounds on a particular tool. Then we find that the governance process breaks. So suddenly our governance groups get different information from different projects. The Waterfall projects provide status reports based on task completion, spend, utilization. Our Agile projects are providing data based on working software, risk and value realization. And of course, the information from the Agile team is more volatile. It moves more often. So all of those governance processes have to change, and the people, as part of that governance process, have to accept that Agile projects are presented in a different way. Then our customer starts to break. What we mean by that is the business are now being asked to engage more and more, and often this becomes very, very difficult. The business is used to asking for something to be built, isn't really used to collaborating. So we have to go from asking for infrequent to frequent decisions from the business customer. Once a week isn't going to cut it. So we have to think about the business engagement and making sure that we get that baked in. The finance then breaks, because we've delivered a few projects, results are good, business teams have enjoyed the model, they like the engagement, and now we've got a traditional cycle planning process. We get a bunch of money at the beginning of the year, it's going to be spent on this staff, your book of work gets filled up for the year, which leaves you zero room to be agile. So trying to be agile within that context is very, very difficult. So we're not asking now for $9 million up front to do something. We want £100,000 to market test the idea before we spend any more money. So our cycle planning and our product pipeline has to change. The way we manage our portfolios has to change. And then you'll find, really, if you're doing it, your organizational structure has to change. That no longer are we aligned behind silos, but we are aligned behind value streams. And if you're on SAFE, you know, you have agile release trains and persistent teams that are behind all of those organizational business platforms. So things break, and a lot of people can't get past the tools bit. So over to you, Manav, for our last few slides on is Enterprise Agile the new Waterfall?
Yeah. So I'm just conscious, I think we want to give some time for the Q&A. So if you move on to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So really, I think ultimately, Waterfall sometimes might feel like mastering the art of prophecy. And you can see some statements on here where people have made some predictions and they haven't quite worked out as they would have expected that to be. And that, for me, sort of somewhat reminds us of thinking where, yes, we do sort of plan for things in a way we expect them to shape, whether it's requirements, whether it's product strategy, whether it is some sort of delivery, whether even if it's a technical upgrade. There are standish reports out there where we know that the plan-driven thinking hasn't quite worked. In fact, 80% of projects are either over budget or over the time. And when we start to look at customer satisfaction side of things, well, that paints another interesting picture all along. So from that point of view, if we look at it, we know that we haven't mastered the art of prophecy. And if we go on to the next slide then, ultimately, to be successful, you need to start thinking about Agile as a culture and not just a product or family of processes. That's a very, very important fundamental statement. It isn't easy because we are very used to following the process, but not actually standing back and looking at it from what impact did it actually have. And yes, measuring culture is a little bit difficult because it is the way things get done here. So if you move on to the next slide, which should be a wrap-up slide, no, one before. Yeah,
Not
so
quite.
So and the way to do that is just to explain this in a different way about the cultural aspect of it. If an organization starts to adopt Agile, the culture remains as is, because an adoption means we are taking something and we are working it into our working model, in our ways of working. We are building adapters, as it's explained here in the model, which was done by who did this one? Okay, I'll come back.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
No, sorry.
This was done by William Schneider and then adapted in an Agile conference earlier. But the idea is, if you then look towards the right, the transformation means that you're leading this as a change program. You are understanding the organization and you're impacting the organization. And hence, what you find here is that when it is about transformation, when it is on the right-hand side, then it has a much better prospect of making that holistic change within the organization. So then if we move on to the last slide, which is sort of a summary slide. So what are the key takeaways from what we've just discussed? There are scaling frameworks, and we discussed sort of half a dozen of them, at least in a very quick way, but we gave you that idea. These are templates. These are not gospels. This is not just a box of processes. If an organization or if an individual or if a CXO thinks, you know what, if only implementing X framework will solve all our problems, these are not anecdotes. And if they are thinking that way, for a start, well, then we are back into our plan-driven prescriptive waterfall thinking. So that pattern needs to be managed. And as George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And Jorgen Appello to say, all models are useful, but some fail faster than others. So you need to then figure out which model will get your organization to fail fast, because then you can do something about it. Or in other words, some people say learn fast. And of course, the organization who see greatest benefits from Agile are the ones who cultivate an Agile culture throughout the organization, and the importance of that we have discussed. And I would like to end with this to say, Agile is a framework within which we need to inspect and adapt. It's really, really, really important. If you get something, it works straitjacket in your organization, it is definitely not Agile. It's very frustrating for those who are looking for procedure and silver bullet or final answer, and there are a lot of people out there. So all we can say is just be careful in the way you scale your enterprise agility and look up to some of these ideas. If you think it's all going to just work out of box, it won't. So Steve, anything, closing comments from your side?
No, I completely concur, and I think hopefully one of the messages you take away is that without thinking about the end game and where you want to get to, just letting stuff grow organically may result in a longer term problem. So you need to think about your transformation very strategically, so you do need to think about your vision and so on. So yeah, that's I agree with everything you just said, Manav.
Okay, I don't hear that often, but I agree.
No, yeah.
Okay, so I think we formally go into Q&A. We got 2 questions already come up in the chat window, so I will read that out to you, Steve, as well as to everyone else.
Okay.
So the first one is from Thomas Walter. What is your recommendation for the following situation? We do have a customer which has no experience in Agile, at least the persons in this project, business and IT, but wants to run a project which a small software vendor, with a small software vendor who is providing the core software, is developing Agile. and TCS as the integrator, well, that's interesting, okay, is asked to run functional and technical sprints with the customer business and customer IT, internal and external service providers. And said software vendor, so except for software vendor, no one is really experienced in Agile. Do you think this could work? It has to. And what can we do to increase the likelihood of success?
Yeah, it'd be nice if we could cut and paste that into something, Manav, because that was a long question.
Yes. Copy. Okay. I think essentially what that means is that there are multiple parties involved, and there's a system integration thing, and then no one other software vendor is experienced in Agile. So how will the third parties and the interfaces and all will align to that? I can make a start on that, Steve, if you want.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
So I think one of the important things we need to think about this is not just as a project or an implementation, but actually a program of work. So rather than saying, okay, what sprints will do, we need to work towards understanding what the overall program is trying to achieve. In some sense, it's a bit like, okay, working with 2 or 3 different partners and they're doing a bit of their own thing, because unless there are straight commonalities, you may not be able to do things in a cross-functional sprint. So what you'll need to figure out is that maybe there are 2 or 3 sprints running, but how do you then integrate the outputs of those sprints and look at maybe even Scrum of Scrums as a concept, or if you want to look at scaled Agile, that has some ideas around the program level working. So I would suggest look up those things and see if those would work. When you have multi-vendor, multi-party situation, unless they're all working towards a common sprint objective, aligning outputs every 2 weeks or so might be quite difficult. You might have to look at a slightly longer timeline, and hence it becomes more of a Scrum of Scrums.
Yep. My input is, and it's difficult to know without the exact circumstance. However, I think when you are running non-agile teams with agile teams, you have to still break your software releases into releases. Each of those releases represents a milestone. Your teams that can run agile will be running their sprints and will be demonstrating value every sprint. That's lovely. Those who aren't running agile, though, should be running whatever process they run within their environment, but having very, very clear goals about what you're trying to achieve at every integration milestone. Having those integration milestones that perhaps traditionally you would in a waterfall project, especially a big project, might be 9 months away. You should be doing that much more regularly. So by having early and integration points early and often, you will be vastly reducing your risk of having lots of open scope within which defects can grow, in which defects can cause problems, and even you get 9 months down the line and you try and integrate, trying to untie the tangle of the impacts that defect has, where it's had more and more stuff built on top of it, becomes even harder to unravel. So don't forget that Agile is, as much as anything, a way of thinking, and if you are trying to get people to collaborate more, you can still have people have daily calls to say, okay, how's your stuff going? You can still have regular increments of working software. You can still think about how do we collaborate better. Perhaps we use Yammer or whatever it is, so we can have virtual teams. Perhaps we even get people to work alongside each other even though they're in different companies. So there are all these things that you can do to try to get a more collaborative environment going, even if you do have all of these various what would I call it, maturities of agile understanding. And I would potentially get a coach on board to help shepherd you through it. That's my answer.
Okay, then getting on to the next question, which is from Ujwal Larry. how does one reconcile the apparent contradiction that agile teams in a large program are unable to plan for long terms, whereas senior management, business, and customers expect them to commit for long-term goals and dates?
I don't see the contradiction. I think in Agile you do have to.
Exactly.
No.
So I guess this is where you talk. I think this is where I would draw a comparison to say you're probably looking at Agile 1.0, where it's just a Scrum-based approach. Let's all get together, create a backlog, and someday we'll get through that. Agile is highly disciplined, and actually, even if you were doing that, you could still very well plan your product backlog or order product backlog in a way, and if you have some idea of how soon you can get through that by the way of velocity, you could actually then give a prediction. But one of the things is that it's still an estimate, and that doesn't change. Now in scaled methods, one of the good thing is that you plan in longer increments. So whichever method you take, it will, as we said, Scrum is at the heart of it, but it does realize this particular challenge where people have just looked at Scrum and sprints and said, oh, we're only going to look at 2 weeks, right? That's all what we know. That's just a wrong behavior. But one of the problems these scale methods are trying to solve out of box is to say, you need to plan in a longer timeline. So you can't just say, I'm going to do things in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. You need to look at bigger planning horizons. So while this can be done, even in Agile 1.0, because it's not been done, people are now taking this as a taking scaled approaches as one of the change enablers, if you like, to plan for longer term. But it's not a
and I think and I think it does represent what we were trying to communicate earlier, that when you have lots of teams that are, for example, are dotted around the place that you now want to bring together in a program, some of the frameworks will want you to try to synchronize story points. And you'll find some of these things sound anti-agile. But actually in a large enterprise, when you've got to coordinate 50, 100 people, I went through this in a digital program, without that synchronization and alignment and transparency for the whole program, it's very difficult to get that enterprise agility. And you'll find that teams want to be independently producing lots of stuff, but unless that's aligned to what the business wants, then actually you're not got business agility at all. You've just got that sort of local optimization, which is in nobody's interest.
And those were the only 2 questions which we had in the chat window. So,
oh dear.
We've still got 5 minutes to go. If you have any other questions, please feel free to type.
I mean, so one thing I was just thinking about is, we've talked a little bit about this about management support, and I think what we've started to see is, particularly with these scaled approaches, that having a very clear transformation management perspective is really important, and the change management of Agile is really important. And I know on one of our previous slides we could see a little bit of the Kotter. I'll just go back to there. There's in there Kotter's 8 commandments of organizational change. And I think creating a coalition in your organization at a very high level who are responsible, actually spending time coming up with a vision is not an easy thing to do, because it's an IT biz vision, a BT vision. Let's be really clear what it is we want to do. So all of this sort of act and empower, and all of those things are really difficult, and creating a center of excellence, I think, is a good key part of that. So if you are looking to go through some of these transformations, I think you can do worse than bone up on Kotter.
Right. Okay, we got more questions which have come up. In fact, I must apologize. One of the ones which scrolled up there was from Carl Zumeli. When UX team tries to work with sprints, they can't keep up the pace. If they do the work up front because the requirements change frequently, they end up with many requests. How should we position UX members in Scrum teams?
Right. That's a very good question. So, should you actually have UX members in Scrum teams? I think that's a really interesting point. Now, the way in which, for example, some of the scaled methods deal with this is to say everybody needs to be on the program. So in the small scale, in sort of Agile 1.0, you've got teams, and you probably find you've got four UX experts, and they get seconded to the wireframes, and they go away and come back. When you've got to coordinate a program of work, and you've got multiple teams, then you can't afford usually to have one UX person on the team. But because you've got this larger planning horizon, what you really need to do is get everybody in the program collaborating and planning together, and that includes the UX guys. So what you need to do is, when you plan for your next 4 or 5 sprints, you look for your dependencies between teams, and some of those dependencies will be on UX help. So you need to plan for all of that ahead of time, and sometimes it will be wireframes, sometimes it might be style sheets or whatever it is, but you do need to plan for it ahead of time. So you can't treat UX just as we need some of that now, or because you will always find that the UX guys are overworked. And you may find that you need to reorganize the order in which you do work to make sure that your UX guys are able to contribute to the programs. But yeah, they are a bit like architects and so on. UX guys do need to be part of the team, and I think part of the team now is at that program level.
Okay, and I would concur with that. With 1 minute to go, we got a couple of more questions, and one is from Apala Mukherjee. That name rings a bell. What can be done to what can be done to bring about change in style of leadership and management in an enterprise level agile transformation?
Yes, that's an easy one to answer, but hard to do, right?
Yes.
So our experience is that leaders think they know what agile is, because it is obviously just about getting what they want quicker. However, what we find is, if you can get to senior managers and get them through training, they very rapidly change their views. And we've seen that in some very senior people in global corporations, where, having gone through 2 days training, getting them to training is hard enough, but having gone through the training, they then say, this isn't about process, is it? This is about changing the behavior and changing how we operate. And you go, yes, you've got it now. And then things start to follow. So the way you have to do it, frankly, is from the sort of things that we do, is you get yourselves invited to senior get-togethers and do little half-hour training bites, and you have to continually have this sort of drip of training and learning. And what I was saying earlier about the way you manage some of these things is, effectively, you have to have a transformation stakeholder management. You have to say, who are the people, who's doing what, who are going to hold us back, who's going to help us, and how do we help move them forward in their understanding of Agile.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that I think I totally agree with whatever Steve you said. The only thing is, you need to be able to message it correctly to the senior management team. You cannot say to them, yeah, just come along to my 2-week sprint. That's not the answer.
Yeah.
So one it is it has to be, so most of the senior executives, they understand the language of numbers. So if you can demonstrate that what quantifiable benefit will this change bring to them, then yes, you get the yes. And then equally, to be able to show how they can succeed in their personal objectives and how the whole of their organization can succeed. I think that if we get those key messages across, then yes, they will. And then the training which he was referring to is actually a change leader training. It is not the practitioner training. So once we do all of that, that works. I know we're over time. The last question was, do you have a recommendation for a survey tool to determine degree of readiness to migrate to cross-organizational agile culture? I think you're just asking for the survey tool. We'll just use anything, maybe SurveyMonkey or
yeah, you get TCS in. We'll do it for you.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I think we are over the time, and we've concluded with all the questions. So all I can say is thanks ever so much for taking time out of your working schedule and joining us on this webinar. Hope it's been very helpful. We will be in Agile Business Conference next week in UK, 5th and 6th of October. We will have a lovely stand and everything. You can meet Steve and me, and if you get any questions unanswered, feel free to post it to them, post it to us, or if you are there, we'll just answer that in person for you. And thanks ever so much for your time.